Welcome back to another episode of the Ink and Impact podcast. I am so thrilled to have author Rebecca George on here, who has just recently released a new book, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But first, welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so grateful to be here today with you.
So, the title of your book is Do the Thing: Gospel Centered Goals, Gumption, and Grace for the Go Getter Girl. This is such an apt title for the work we do as writers, I believe, because it does take a lot of gumption and grace. And as
Sure.
Christian writers, which this audience is, our calling. God's goal is for
Yeah.
us to share his message in a variety of different ways in the work that we write. And so today I thought that we would talk a little bit about what led you to write this book and
Mhm.
then some of your experience of writing it to kind of encourage and guide some of those other aspiring authors and even ones who have written a book or two in the past. We can all continue to learn from each other.
Absolutely.
So take us back to what led you to write this book.
Well, I would say my entire life, I have loved books. I have loved words. When I was a child, I would play librarian. So even looking that far back, I can see a couple of threads that have
Yes.
kind of marked my life. And one
Okay.
of them is I love words. So most of my adult life, if asked, I would tell you my ultimate dream would be to write books and to do this work. It has certainly been a long journey for me, but as I look back over the last 10 years or so, I was discipling college girls in my living room floor teaching the Bible. And that I think is a thread that has led towards the work that I do now. I needed the refining that came along in that season to be prepared for the work that I do now, which I think is important to call out and to say. And I found myself having these conversations with women at the beginning when I started speaking. I was leading a ministry where we donated handmade hats and handwritten letters of encouragement to cancer patients in treatment centers all over the country. We did work with St. Jude and MD Anderson and all sorts of awesome organizations. And as I did that work, I would be invited to speak and share about what God was doing. And as I did, I'd have these women come up to me afterwards and say something to the effect of, I love this work God has led you to do. And in some way, I feel my heart stirred towards maybe a particular need I see in the world or a particular way that I could use my gifts and talents to glorify God. And almost every time they would hush to a whisper, something would be kind of holding them back. They'd say, but I don't know, somebody out there's probably already doing it. Or maybe I'm not the girl for this job. There were all of these reasons why maybe they were held back. And I think as a communicator, as a writer, you reach a point where you think, okay, there are these common things that are holding us back. I want to have a conversation around that. And I want to point us to biblical truth as it pertains to that. And so I think I reached that point where it was like, okay, not on my watch any longer. Will the enemy get this foothold in our lives as it pertains to our call? And I want to have that conversation with women. And so that's really, I think, how it evolved in me and how it stirred up in me over time and kind of where the thread came from.
I think that's so relatable to us writers because so often we'll be like, well, why should I write about this certain topic? It's been written about umpteen times before. There are other people that are more quote unquote famous or popular that have done this. But I believe that God places that particular topic, that particular calling on us for a reason, for a purpose. And, He's given each of us a unique voice. And he's
Yeah.
given each of us unique experiences that lead up to it, like with you. You had that unique calling to help with the notes and the handmade hats and things. And like you said, women were already recognizing that he'd given them this unique calling. So it's just getting the courage to step out in faith, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So God led you to notice these threads and you felt called to write this book. One of the themes of the book is using your gifts and talents for the glory of God and not for self. And related to that, I think, is treating our calling seriously instead of as a side hobby. And that's something that I try to encourage writers here on the podcast too. That's a running theme for me as well. And so I wondered if you'd just speak to that a little bit about how we can maybe prevent or notice when we're working for ourselves as opposed to God.
Yeah. I think we do this so often, and I'll give a quick context to how the Lord has really done a work in me in this area. In 2019, I married my husband, which moved me to South Mississippi for a few years, where he was a lead pastor there. And in that particular town that we lived in, it was very small. There were about 12,000 people in the town. And most women that I was surrounded by, which mostly were church members, were either stay at home moms, school teachers, or nurses, which are 3 high and holy callings for a woman, right? Absolutely, 100%.
Absolutely.
And none of those things were me. And so in that same season was the season in which God began really opening some doors for this dream of becoming an author to come true, and I wrote the book in that season. And so there was this temptation as I had conversations with women in my everyday life who, of no fault of their own, didn't understand my work. There was
Right.
this temptation to sort of play small and act like, well, it's just this little side project that I have. It's just this little dream that God's opening some doors for, and we'll see what he has. And I treated it small. And I remember a day where I had gotten off a podcast interview for my own podcast and had interviewed someone that I have just really admired for a long time. And they coached me along the way of just some things to consider as I walked through the publishing process. And I remember getting off that call so encouraged and also simultaneously convicted by the Holy Spirit telling me, "You've been acting like this is just this cute little thing. And I am not small. God is not small. And so therefore the things I call you to do aren't small in my kingdom. Like they
Mm,
are significant, even if it's taken a little courage to see like, oh, I am the girl for this job. And so I think we do that a lot. And I think the earmarks of it we can begin to recognize when maybe we're walking away from a conversation and we've said things like what I just said, you know, it's just this little side project, or we'll see what God has. And sometimes I think we do it out of a heart of humility. And I think we have to recognize the value in the work that God has given us to do. Not that he needs us to accomplish his agenda, but it's an honor and a privilege to get to partner with him
it
in
is.
our work. And so we get to see it that way. And there's joy in seeing it that way. So does
Yes.
that resonate?
It does. It does so much. Especially, I think, as women, we tend to belittle our efforts for a
Yeah.
variety of reasons. But God sees such value in each of us, and he gives us these callings. And that was just so convicting to me, whatever you said, that he is not small and he does not give small gifts and
Yeah.
callings. So that was very, very good. I think that for most of us listening, that is the part that relates most. But I just want to point out too that it can go to the opposite extreme too, where
Absolutely.
we have finished writing our book and maybe it is a success. And then suddenly we find ourselves patting ourselves on the back a little bit, right? So that's where it needs to be a balance of, okay, remember who gave you that calling, remember whose book this really is.
That's
And it's
right.
not all us. So it's a constant keeping our eyes on Jesus is what it really
Yeah.
all comes down to.
Yeah.
You said you were writing this book as you were living in this small town. So, what was that writing process like? Was it just came in a flood and you were done, or was it a
Mm.
long drawn out process? You mentioned about having to run at the pace of grace, and I was wondering if maybe that played into the writing of the book as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say I, in that season, walked through, as we all did, the pandemic. We were leading the church through that. I was walking
Oh yeah.
alongside my husband in local church ministry as we all faced what we faced in, 2020, 2021. And I had a full-time job outside of that I worked remotely. And so it wasn't this glorified destination that sometimes as writers we imagine where, we rent a cabin for a week and the words just flood to us and they just come and we walk out of that cabin with, a 50,000 word manuscript just totally dead. That was not my
Right.
experience. I wrote this book in the nooks and crannies of my everyday life as a worn out, exhausted pastor's wife who also had another job. So to be just like super honest,
Yeah.
that was my reality. And I will say from a process standpoint, I did walk through kind of the traditional process. So I got an agent. I worked with my agent on my book proposal for about a year before we pitched the book to different publishing houses. We've written sample content for the pitching process. And so 3 chapters were already pretty well written at that stage.
Right.
And so I signed my contract in August of 21 and my manuscript was not due until the following March. So I had about 7 months or so to finish the book. And I really, this time, I don't know how it'll be for my second book, but I remember at the beginning thinking, okay, if I every business day of the week sat down and wrote 1,000 words, I could be done by X date. And I thought it was going to be this very methodical process because that's typically how I think.
Yeah.
And I got about 2 weeks in and I realized like some days I'm going to walk out with 2,500 words and praise God for that.
Yes.
And there are going to be days where I sit down and the 250 words that I fight for are going to be my contribution that day. And praise God for that too.
Yes. Thank you for
You
sharing
know,
that because that is the reality of the writing life.
it is. And so maybe that's more honesty than people want, but that is what this looked like for me. And
Yeah.
so I don't know what questions that brings about, but that's kind of how it went.
As the time came closer, were you more of what they call a pantser, trying to finish it at the last minute, or did God's grace get you through and it was relatively done by the time the deadline came?
Yeah. It was one of those situations where I had to choose to be done.
Mm,
You know what I mean?
that's a good word right
So
there.
I probably finished the manuscript and I had a friend edit through it. A couple people read it, my husband included, before I turned it in. And that was probably happening in January. So I spent February kind of just stewing and rereading. I probably read that manuscript 7 times before I turned it in the first time. I think that is a trap we can get stuck in as writers as well.
Mhm.
And that's the beautiful thing that comes with a deadline because there does reach a date where you have to say, I'm done.
Yes.
And I think I knew in my heart when I was stepping into like the perfectionist kind of mentality and I needed to just say, okay, for now, I'm going to let my editor take this and in a beautiful way rip it apart.
Right.
And I'll put it back together again. And so while I do want to pursue excellence in what I turn in and I want to be proud of my work, I also recognize that we're not done yet. It was definitely more of a choice to be done than it was like racing to the finish line, which I
Yeah,
think is a
that's
gift.
good. That is. Let's talk a bit about that editing process, shall we?
Let's talk about it.
Yeah. So, having served as an editor myself, the goal of an editor is not to just wield this big red pen and put as many ink marks as we can on the
Yes.
paper. That's not the goal. The goal is to enhance the story, make it the best that it possibly can be for that writer. So, walk us through what your editing experience was like.
I would love to. So I absolutely adore my editor. I worked with Julie Cantrell, who you may know as a novelist. She has written several amazing novels. And so as an author herself, I think she comes to the editing process with a really unique perspective. And I think the Lord knew I needed that in my first book. Her kindness and coaching along the way was so incredibly helpful and just truly a gift from God. And so when I turned my manuscript in, my publisher and I discussed, this is Julie. This is who's going to be doing your developmental editing. So for somebody who's coming to the conversation and doesn't really know what that means, in the traditional process, your book will go through multiple rounds of editing, the first of which is developmental edits, which is sort of the global look at the entire work to say, okay, does this structure work? Are there stories that don't quite fit? So it's sort of a big look at the whole book. You're not moving commas at that point,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so that's the point where I worked with Julie. And then from there, it goes into the copy editing, which is commas, grammar, all that stuff, and
Yes.
making sure that's right. So in my time with Julie, I turned the manuscript in, and we would talk back and forth over Voxer as she was kind of working through it. And she'd run ideas by me and say, "You're going to see this when you get the manuscript back, and here's why." And so she was so kind in doing that. And I remember exactly where I was when she sent my first round of edits back to me. I was in Nashville at a conference, and it was like the Lord had just preserved this morning for me to process through getting my edits back. I had about half a day before the conference started, just of alone time. I'd gotten to Nashville before some of my friends. And so I went to a coffee shop. I remember which coffee shop in Franklin, Tennessee I was sitting at when I worked on my edits for the first time. And when I say what I'm about to say, I think there may be listeners who feel tempted to say, like, "Oh, well, that's cute and all that she had that experience, but my experience was horrible." And I just want to say that I think if we're open to being coachable and we're open to seeing the editing process, as you're saying, as this beautiful opportunity to continue to grow as a writer and really to fight for your reader at the end of the day and make this book the best book that it can be, the editing process will be a lot more fun.
Yes.
If you are not willing to see it from a lens of humility and being coachable, it will be miserable. And I've had friends on both sides
Mhm.
who have walked through it and seen it in both ways.
That's well said. That's very true.
Yes. And so for me, was there a moment where I thought, "Oh, man, I'm a horrible writer, and she ripped this apart?" Sure, I had that, like, half a second, right? And we have that choice in that little half second to say, "I'm either going to choose a heart of humility and being willing to be coached, or I'm gonna make this miserable on myself." And so, I think that's important to say as we talk through the editing process
I
because it
agree.
is hard, it takes a lot of time. At the end of the day, you're trying to make the best, but everybody's end goal is to make this experience for the reader the best it can be.
Yes. So when you open up those edits, what was your reaction?
I had been warned.
Yes.
Enough friends had told me what to expect that I wasn't shocked when I saw a lot of red, right?
Mhm.
And I think one of the most helpful things I quickly did was change the settings in my Word doc where I could only see the final work without all of the red, without all the comments, without all the red, so I could read it as she edited it. How is this sounding?
Yeah, just for listeners, that would be the track comments. So you turned off the track
Yes.
comments.
Yes, that's right. And I found that to be so helpful rather than picking apart everything she had changed, just to look at it and say, "Oh, yeah, that makes sense. That does actually sound better than the way I had it written." So I think that really helped me. And this is so cliche, but it's true. You just have to eat the elephant one bite at a time. And
Yeah.
so I remember reading through kind of quickly most of the manuscript, and then I just got started in kind of working through each individual chapter. And I'd set a goal for myself, right? Like I've, let's say, got 2 hours at a coffee shop. I'd say, okay, I'm going to get through the intro
Right.
as I'm sitting here. And the next time I'm going to get through chapter 1. So you just kind of have to chip away at it.
That's excellent advice. I agree with that. So you were able to finish writing your draft. You submitted it. You're in the editing process. Walk us through how long did it take from editing to finished published book?
Yeah. So turned in the manuscript in March. I think by midsummer, we were pretty much done with edits. So 2 or 3 months of back and forth with Julie, my developmental editor, and then it went to copy editing. I think a lot of myself included, a lot of authors, by that point, you're kind of over it, right? You're
Yes.
just over it and you don't care where commas go. If that's better and more grammatically correct to you. And that's just me as a growing writer. Maybe 10 years from now, I will feel much more strongly about that part of the process. My husband is an English major. And so to him, he would probably cringe to hear me admit that. But my gift, I think, in this part of the process is not having an English degree or editing experience. My gift is the storytelling piece. That's a lot of authors, right? And so
Mhm.
the craft of writing comes with experience. And so I think I just reached that point where I was like, okay, great. Like check, 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 because I'm over it. There are things you care about and things you don't care as much about, I think, in the process. And I think there's permission for that.
Good.
We all have different gifts
Yes.
in this process that we come to the table with. By summer, we were looking at covers and beginning to think about marketing, which is a whole nother beast. And so, yeah, I think 3 to 5 months or so.
The quote that you had in your book is scrappy gets us past the start line. Intentional helps us endure the hard days. I can imagine that that not only applies to the writing process, but to the marketing process. Is that a fair
That is
assessment?
very fair. That is very fair. I'll use the example of starting a podcast. When I started my podcast, Radical Radiance, I did not buy the mic that I have now.
Mhm.
I didn't know if this was going to last. I didn't know if it was going to be something that stuck. And so I ordered a cheap USB mic off Amazon, which is what I needed in that moment. Right. And in a similar way with marketing a book, there were things that we had budget for, and there were things that I had to be scrappy and do myself. I did a lot of pitching to be on podcasts myself, this podcast included. I reached out to you
Yes.
because I thought the message would be a good fit for your audience. And so some of those things you have to dig in and be scrappy. Some of those things you can have an intentional budget to put towards or things like that. And I think that comes in a case by case basis as you consider different parts of this process.
That's
So,
true. When I consider scrappiness too, I think that that is like a short burst of energy, right? And then you
yeah.
get tired, whereas you need that intentionality to keep going, right? The book isn't going to sell itself, right? You
Right.
have to be intentional about marketing that book. And
Yeah.
a lot of our listeners are self-published authors, and that is really so important
Yeah.
to be intentional, to be consistent,
Mhm.
and to remember your calling. Remember that this book is going to serve readers so well and point them to a message that God has inspired you to write. Along those lines, another quote that I loved from your book was, "It's not about the extravagant deed, but metered faithfulness." So, as you're writing and publishing and now you're marketing, how have you seen God at work in you through this? And has it built your faithfulness? Has it enhanced it?
Absolutely. You can probably tell early on in the book that I have struggled with performance and achievement most of my life. Like that's a rub area for me where I really have to submit to the Lord and trust that He is at work and He is the opener of doors in ways that I can't shove them open. That's a challenge for me with humility, admit that. And so I think in watching him do what only he can do through this message, it has just continued to build my faith in remembering he is the God who does immeasurably more than all we could ask or imagine. That is not on us or up to us to strive to achieve. There's a quote in the book that says, the outcome is his, but the obedience is ours. And I think that's it. Even in launching a book, we are not the opener of doors, but we do take that next step when an opportunity is presented. We continue to move forward in faithfulness. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Yes.
And, I've been thinking about particularly the marketing piece and taking steps towards that since last September or October. And so, am I weary and tired in moments? Yes. Do I have to take intentional time to say, okay, this week I am not recording any podcasts. I am going to work on this particular piece and save this for later and run at a pace that's sustainable. Because, like many of your listeners, I hope I'm still doing this work in 10 years. And if I get burnt out and I lose my joy in it, I won't be. And
Right.
so, I think that's a everyday continued conversation with the Lord as he gives us wisdom and discernment and how to walk this journey out well. And yeah, it has absolutely built my faith. It has encouraged my heart so much to just see the people that he has sent to champion this message alongside me
Mm.
and to
Mm.
remember it's not all on me. That is
Yeah.
such a gift. So yeah, it has encouraged my heart in so many ways.
I love that you are still speaking with such joy about the writing process and even the marketing. And I've heard you twice now refer to a second book. So
Yeah.
this experience didn't, knock you out of the water. You're still in there
Yes.
swimming. So are you able to say a little bit about what the next book will be about?
Yes. So it will come out spring of 2025. So I'll be writing it this fall into next spring, which I'm actually so excited about. I think our lives as a writer nowadays, there's sort of this cycle, right? There's the writing part, there's the editing portion, there's the marketing piece. And if I think we can find some joy in all of those, we won't get bored because as soon as I'm kind of done with the marketing piece, which I'm kind of beginning to feel that way, I'm ready to write again. I'm ready to
Yes.
dig into this new message. I'm super excited about it. I would say the core felt need for the reader is what do we do with our longings?
Mm, mm.
And that's as far as I'll go
Yeah,
today, but
that's good.
I am so excited to see what God does with this message. I think your first book is when your dream comes true as a writer and a someone who's dreamed of doing this for a long time, and this message feels special and needed and valuable in a different, maybe even more significant way than Do the
Mm,
Thing. I'm
mm.
really proud of Do the Thing, and
Sure.
I'm so excited to see what God continues to do with it, and this second one is, like, bubbling up out of me, and I can't wait to write it.
Yes. Well, it's just like having children. They each have that special place
Yeah,
in your heart. You're not going to just
sure.
kick one out of the house when the second one's born, right? So that's awesome. Congratulations. I'm excited for you.
You.
And another final quote, speaking about God giving us these messages and now giving you a second book to work on, is the quote that you have here, that God holds the pen to your life. And trust me, he is a brilliant author. I love that so much. I don't know if you can see my shirt that I'm wearing here. It says, "Your story is not over yet. Pick up your pen and keep writing."
I
And
love that.
that is just, it's literal and figurative, right? We do have to pick
Yeah,
up this literal pen, but we have to also turn to God, who, like you
yeah.
said, is the pen of our life. He's the author of life. So, yeah, I just love that quote
I love
very
that.
much. Trying to be conscientious of time here for you and our listeners. But one thing that I always ask guests is, what is one book, in addition to the Bible, that really made an impact in your life? It could be a book from your childhood or more recently.
Mm. The one that's coming to mind is a short read, but one that you have to really stir on and read slowly is The Purpose of Man by A.W. Tozer. It really helped me see, again, in this vein of our calling and our work, that the purpose of man this side of heaven is to worship God and enjoy him forever, is the quote that most people remember and take from that book. And that's so true. And it's just encouraged my heart in such a profound way.
Such a great recommendation. I love that. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It has been a pleasure getting to meet you and learn about your book process. I wish you every success with it.
Thank you, friend. Thanks for having me.